Billions of dollars have flowed into longevity over the last 5 years. Great science, great protocols, and most longevity businesses are still losing money.
That's the paradox. We understand aging better than ever before, and somewhere between the lab and the waiting room, it all breaks.
Our guest today built one of the first national longevity brands and has seen exactly where the break happens. Harvard Medical School, Harvard Business School trained, founded Modern Age, now advising Superpower and MediHealth, and building next generation medicine. Today, we are going to talk about the business of longevity, peptides, stem cells, the over-optimization problem, and much more. Dr. Anand, welcome to Return on Health.
Niko, Miguel, thank you so much for having me on. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Likewise. Okay, let's start with Modern Age. You built the first national integrated longevity clinic. Today, you're advising and educating instead of scaling it further as the CEO. Can you walk us through what happened?
Yeah, so I joined Modern Age in 2021 as the founding chief medical officer. And back then, the concept of longevity was not really very well known. Prominently at that point in time, when people were receiving longevity care, it was usually happening in a high-end concierge clinic that probably charged, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so what we were trying to do at Modern Age was figure out how do we take this concept, which actually we saw from our customer research had a lot of resonance. How do we make it more accessible to more people? And back then it was actually very challenging to educate people. Like a lot of people, when they heard longevity, they thought of geriatrics and this concept being only for older people, which of course longevity medicine is for older people, but it's really for everyone as we kind of now understand it. But it was a lot of trying to figure out how do we take this concept and make it more accessible, and how do we build a business and a program around it. And I'm actually proud to say that I think we made a lot of the right decisions. Like we kind of looked at this overall concept of longevity and we unbundled it into a set of services and offerings that I think actually reflect what's working today, right? Like we had a hero product that was basically, a function health type diagnostic before function existed. And that was actually doing very well. We had therapeutic focused programs on certain hero therapies like hormone replacement therapy, testosterone replacement, GLP-1s. And again, you see now how all of these have taken off. So I think we actually got a lot of things right, that these formulations were probably the best way to enter the market. And to be honest with you, I mean, I can't get into all the details, but I'll just say that the reason Modern Age isn't around has nothing to do or very little to do with the actual business and the traction that we had. We actually had pretty solid traction. It had more to do with timing and valuation. And I mean, just in a word, right? Like we raised money at the absolute top of the market in 2021 when money was free and interest rates were zero and people were just, it was crazy, right? Like it was the equivalent of the dot-com boom, right? It was just absolutely crazy. And so what that meant was that we had an insanely high valuation attached to our company. And when we then tried to raise our next round of funding in entirely different environment, right? Like when we were trying to raise, the Ukraine war had just broken out. We were in a recession and it was hard, right? And no one really wanted to, I mean, yeah, it was hard to do it. And so I actually think that the business itself was great. I think the timing was just not right. And really, a lot of companies that raised in that time period are struggling today, or if they are still around. But what I've done instead of continuing a Modern Age is taking everything I've learned through that experience, and now I advise some amazing companies in the space. And then I also have built this business, Next Generation Medicine, which is really designed to educate and empower people who are building in the space.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Kind of you having seen what has happened in the past 5 years, because in 2021 there was a completely different market environment, but also customers had a very different understanding and relationship with health optimization and longevity. And I would love to take a step back or look a bit, what happened before. What got you interested in that whole sector in the first place more than 5 years ago? Was it the patients you've seen before? Was it the rates of certain diseases that shocked you, that just wanted you to take a different approach? What led you into all of this space in the first place?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, Miguel. And I think for a lot of us in the field, at least today, it's actually something personal, right? That brought us in. And that's true for me. For me, it was really the discovery, and this happened around 2019 and 2020, that in both my family and in my wife's family, we have two separate hereditary syndromes that run in our family, right? We've discovered that in my wife's family, there is a condition or a gene known as BRCA, which I'm sure your audience or you guys are familiar with, that predisposes to certain cancers. In my family, we have a gene connected to a syndrome known as Lynch syndrome, and that predisposes to a different set of cancers. And I'll note that I do feel very fortunate that neither me nor my wife tested as carriers. But nonetheless, we were, for a while, we didn't know our status. And we certainly had family members who are affected. And this then prompted for me a journey into really asking the difficult question of what is something that people can do to affect how something like this can influence your health and long-term consequences. And I found that my medical training, despite, training with some incredibly smart and amazing people, amazing places, didn't give me very much that felt empowering, right? It was mostly like, hey, do some screening tests and more or less hope for the best. And that just didn't feel satisfying. And so I kind of dove into this field on my own for my own interest, for my family's interest, and found that actually there was this different paradigm of thinking about health in a way that was more personal, more nuanced, right? Not just looking at what some society says is the guideline, really looking at the individual, what their risks and benefits are, and then arriving at decisions that really reflect the goals of the individual. And that really resonated for me. And so, yeah, I spent like 2 years just kind of learning on my own. I attended a number of courses, pretty much just sucked up anything that I could like a sponge about the space. And then ultimately, at this point in time, I was working at a healthcare tech company called Verta, and I learned a lot about building businesses and using technology to do that. I decided that I wanted to start a company in this space, taking everything I learned about technology and business from Verta with this new clinical interest. And then around that time, I got recruited to be the founding CMO at Modern Age. So that's kind of how I got here. And I still think, as I said before, a lot of people who are in the space today often come to it for a personal reason. I don't think that will continue to be the case. I think it's becoming more and more opportunistic. People are now going to be here for money and for other things, which is okay. I mean, just a natural cycle of a market. But yeah, that's what brought me here.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's an amazing story. And I think a lot of people can resonate coming from, like, I don't know, difficult family or health situations, and then really going deep into the field of longevity or health span optimization or whatever you want to call it. What I'm wondering is, I'm sure you've seen a bunch of patients, talk to a lot of different people. Was there anything that surprised you about what people actually wanted, and pretty much compared to what you thought beforehand, what they actually wanted in the first hand? Was there any mismatch? Anything there?
Well, I think one thing that we were surprised by was how broad the appeal of longevity is, right? And I think there was an expectation that the people who would come to us at Modern Age would mostly be um, kind of wealthier people. But we were actually very surprised to see how diverse the sorts of people who came to us. And again, like we had, technically speaking, no way of actually verifying people's income or what have you. But based on what people shared with us about their profession and where they lived and that sort of thing, you could kind of make some inferences. And I think I was just really surprised by how willing people were to invest in their health, right? To spend lots of money, actually, much more than you would think. I think there's a lot of assumptions that, like, oh, people will never want to pay $100 a month for XYZ. But actually people are, right? I think that people increasingly are starting to value their health more, and especially this new formulation of health, which presents it as something that can empower you and make you feel better and more productive today. And not just health as the absence of disease, but rather health is a force for you today to help you get more out of your life. I think that resonates with people, and people invest in it in the same way that they invest in buying expensive clothes or buying cars and all these other things, like this starts to feel more resonant, right? Like if you tell somebody like, oh, spend like I think HRT is a great example for women, right? Like if you tell a woman, hey, you should get onto HRT to lower your risk of osteoporosis and heart disease by 10 to 20%, whatever. Like that doesn't have, that's the way the medical community talks about things. For a lot of people, that just doesn't like land, right? But if you say, hey, get onto HRT and you'll be able to sleep better, you'll be able to think better, you'll be able to have more energy, that lands way better. And both things are true, by the way. Both things that I just said are true. And so I think like people have figured out that we have to include this other type of messaging. So I think that the appeal is quite broad in this new way that we're thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't agree more. And that's also the observation me and Miguel are certainly sharing. I mean, we both work at the longevity clinic ourselves, and the clinic is fully booked. So that really shows that people are more willing to pay more money for different diagnostics, to speaking with experts, to like improving their health in general. More and more people becoming susceptible to pretty much improving their health as a whole, and also paying for that, and not only having insurance pay for this. So there's definitely a shift happening there, especially in the last like maybe 2 or 3 years. There's a big shift happening also due to big health podcast, Brian Johnson obviously. So a lot of momentum happening. I want to talk a bit more about the longevity business, and especially because you are advisor to a bunch of different companies. You've worked with a bunch of different companies, so I'm sure you have a lot of knowledge in this. And I've also heard you say that it's not really the science that kills longevity businesses, it's often execution. There are execution problems. So like
Yes.
looking across all of the companies you've working with, you've seen from the inside, which like sort of failures keep repeating all of the time.
Yeah. I think probably the biggest one is inefficient customer acquisition, right? Like not being thoughtful enough about how to actually get customers. People spend a lot of time thinking about all the different treatments and therapies they can offer and all the bells and whistles. But at the end of the day, if no one is showing up to use them, then you don't have a business. And what I see happen often is people get so caught up in adding so many different things that all seem so cool that the offering just becomes very confusing. I mean, to be very honest with you, if you look at most clinics, you go to their website, it's very confusing. Like, what does this clinic do aside from just offer this like smorgasbord of things? And I think, in the past, right? In the past, longevity clinics and longevity care was a somewhat scarce resource, right? So clinics would kind of get away with being actually pretty bad at merchandising and marketing and that sort of thing because it was so scarce, right? And so people would come to them in spite of how bad their marketing and websites were. But that's changing now. Like now you have really sophisticated players with lots of resources, people who deeply understand customer acquisition, who are entering the game, and it's just not going to cut it anymore. And so I see that as like a pretty common failure mode is that people don't understand how important it is to be very thoughtful about what your message is, who you're for, not trying to be all things for all people, and to spend a lot of time on that. And then based on that, figuring out how can you leverage different channels efficiently, right? And by the way, like Instagram and Meta are not the only ways to acquire customers. They're of course important places, but people often don't give enough consideration to other sources, right? Like local businesses like gyms or even wealth managers. There's lots of different kind of creative ways to acquire customers that people often don't think through. This is something I talk to a lot of my clients about. So I would say like customer acquisition is very common failure mode. There are others, but I would say that's probably the number one.
That's super interesting because, most of these companies are founded by very smart people. They oftentimes have capital, they have good intentions, so they really want to, spread their offering to more people to also have a more positive impact. So usually, likely failure, like intelligence and funding, is not the bottleneck if the business is already existing, but then maybe the like old school business things such as customer acquisition playing a role is definitely super interesting. However, what I wanted to ask is that in the past 5 years, in terms of customer preferences, do you see a shift that customers, despite, us still being in the same sector as 5 years ago, the science has advanced a bit and stuff, of course, but it's still the same sector. Do you see that there is a different preference in terms of what customers want now versus 5 years ago?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, you know, what people want to some extent reflects what is being discussed in the zeitgeist, right? So I think when I first started out in 2021, I would say HRT and TRT were becoming more and more uh, widespread. Like the idea of using these things not in such narrow circumstances, right? Which is kind of how we were taught, like in medical school, to use HRT only when absolutely necessary, like only if somebody's completely suffering should you use it. And TRT, we were taught like only if they have like a testosterone of like less than 200 or even 100 nanograms per deciliter, and also all these different symptoms. Like it was a very, very narrow way of thinking about it. And I would say that was probably the first thing. Then we had GLP-1s, which is just massive, right, for just across the board. And I think the GLP-1 thing is a very interesting example just to reflect on, because GLP-1s have been around for a long time, including Ozempic. Ozempic has been around for actually quite some time. I think 2016, 2017, something like that. Been around for a very long time. Uh, and like the idea of Ozempic having people lose weight is also not new. We were seeing it, but it takes a while for things to get to critical mass where people realize that this is a thing and they start using it, right? And like certainly one part of it is like doing the clinical trials, but like there's also this other kind of broader popular awareness that has to unfold. So I would say HRT, GLP-1s, and then I think now, as I'm sure you guys are aware, there's a lot of interest shifting to peptides, right? Which, and I hate that term, by the way, because it's such a useless term, because it doesn't. I mean, GLP-1s are peptides, of course, but they're somehow considered separate. Insulin is a peptide. I think when people say quote unquote peptides in kind of marketing speak, what they're referring to are these set of like 10 to 13 compounds, some of which are FDA approved compounds, but many of which are kind of more experimental investigational agents that have, different biological effects. So there is a lot of attention and interest shifting to these. And now with RFK Jr., our HHS secretary's announcement that he seems to be signaling that these are going to be kind of, there's going to be a clear framework for physicians to prescribe these. I suspect that's going to be the next big wave of interest. And I think that's what a lot of people expect. You're seeing companies make moves around this, acquiring compounding pharmacies, things like that. So that's my prediction. I don't think I'm being especially bold in making that prediction, but I think it's probably where things are going.
Yeah, definitely. Couldn't agree more. That's definitely not a bold prediction right now in the current times. So let's dive into peptides. It's a super interesting topic. And to give the listeners as well a bit of a background, you mentioned it as well, but in 2023, FDA put 19 peptides on a list that blocked compounding pharmacies from making them. For example, BPC 157, TB 500, and others. But now in February this year, RFK Jr. Went on Joe Rogan and said about 14 of those would be reclassified within weeks. And now the FDA has scheduled a meeting this summer to consider moving 12 off the list, including BPC 157, for example. So, Anand, from inside the field, what's your honest read of what's happening right now?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of things, right? Like depending on where you are, it's exciting, it's scary. Here's how I look at it. I am excited, but for a reason that I don't think a lot of people are articulating. So what is about to happen with peptides is really, in effect, going to be a big experiment in how we do medicine that I think represents the new paradigm of medicine. And what I mean by that is that we are not going to be able, or we shouldn't. If we are, we're failing, right? We are not going to be able to run every single thing that we can test through this 10-year, 3-phase billion-dollar R&D pipeline. It just doesn't make sense, right? Like with AI, we're going to be able to generate so many hypotheses. We're going to be able to envision so many different molecules, so many different methods. This way of testing things is just not going to work. It's not going to work, period. And so we have to find a faster and more innovative way to do things, which I think requires us implicitly to bring things into the market that do not have all of this study that we previously are used to doing. And I think in effect, that's what's going to happen with peptides. And so my hope is that alongside this, that we don't just make these things available, but that we also are intentional about building systems that help us learn about how these things are working, right? I think that's going to be the real key. And I think it's the responsibility of anyone, really, I think it's everyone's responsibility, but especially the people with scale and resources, right? So like people in telehealth, people with platforms, we should be collecting data, we should be monitoring, we should be trying to learn about how these things work and how they influence our biology. Because I think for me, why I love peptides is because they also represent a shift to us thinking about our biology through the lens of cell signaling, rather than thinking about our biology through the lens of organs and body parts, right? Because ultimately, health happens at the unit of the cell. It's not body parts, it's cells and pathways that happen within cells. That's the foundational unit. And so I'm excited about peptides also being a way in which we can shift our thinking in that direction. But I think this all requires us to be very rigorous in how we measure and how we study this. If we just start dishing these out without any kind of monitoring and just, having people use them, I think that will have been a failure, a missed opportunity for us.
Yeah, I think it's personally super interesting discussing this with you here, because I think a year or 1.5 years ago, I've attended peptide webinars of yours, and it was very interesting how there was still, we were in a bit of a different and market environment, so not everyone was talking about it, and you were already going deep into the science of it. And the problem I have with peptides, or the conversation around peptides, is not only the kind of the access thing, whether people are now, it will change how they have access to it, but it's more like the broader thing of this evidence vacuum. So these things are not new. They have been around for decades at times, and people have been using them in experimental ways. And I don't blame them at all, because if you have an issue and you've gone down the traditional route and the traditional route hasn't helped at all, and there is this potential of, hey, maybe this thing will work for you, I don't blame anyone making an informed consent and like an individual risk reward assessment and deciding for themselves, hey, I'm going to try it. But the broader issue I see with that is, how can it be that there are things out there for decades already? There is quite a bit of signal from many people individually reporting that things have helped them, and that they've been sharing this in online forums, but still there was like a proper, well designed trial doesn't exist, and it's not really in sight to be to be released anytime soon. So I think the kind of broader issue of that, what we usually would require for things to find their way into traditional care, if there is a lack of monetary incentive behind them because they're not really patentable, then there's like this issue. So I think it's interesting what you've said, kind of, and maybe I'm now intentionally simplifying it, maybe lowering the evidence standards to gather more information from the individual signal many people will use at that time, to then develop further and go from there. So I think that's definitely an interesting way of putting it, because me and Niko, we're discussing this so often, like how do you go about this? Like these things are out there, people want to use them, and you can't blame them at all. But if there's like not even the possibility of a soon to be released regulatory properly designed trial, then it's a difficult endeavor to manage, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is why collecting data as we use them is so important, right? Because I think that's how we start to do these research studies, right? Because you're right, like there is no financial incentive to run these trials, right, on these therapies. So I think we have to instead rely on so-called real world evidence. I don't like that term, but like, that is probably the best term for it to actually gain inference on what's going on. And I would also say that there's another problem I have with the RCT kind of pivotal trial driven paradigm that we've had, which is this idea that it doesn't really respect biological individuality, right? That the
Yeah, very good
idea
point.
that there is this categorical notion that something is either good or bad for everyone is just biologically false, right? And in fact, there are actually certain therapies, right, that were pulled off the market that actually many patients benefited from and actually are actually used through alternative channels. Like one good example is celecoxib or Celebrex, which was a NSAID that was very useful for pain relief for people with conditions like arthritis and other kind of joint diseases. It was pulled off the market because there was a signal towards increased cardiovascular risk. But many patients tremendously benefit from this. And one of the benefits of it was that it didn't cause nearly the sort of GI issues that most other NSAIDs did. And, of course, like this decision really should be an individual decision, right? If somebody has very low cardiovascular risk, then this is appropriate. Like it's not like there are many things that feed into cardiovascular risk. It's not just one thing, right? It is many, many different factors. It's your blood pressure, it's your inflammation levels, it's your lipid levels, of course. And so there's many, many different things. And so this idea that like, okay, now no one can have this is just to me that just it feels ridiculous to say it, right? But and yet like that's how we operate. And so even with these peptides, right? Like I'm sure that there will be some, if we aggregate it across the population, with some of these peptides, there will be some harm signal in some way. I'm sure. If somehow that isn't the case, I think we probably haven't looked hard enough. I don't think the response should be like, oh shoot, like there's now a slight risk of whatever. Let's take it away for everyone. Like that would be foolish to me. I think what we should be doing is saying, okay, it looks like there's a signal towards this particular condition. So now let's make sure that people who are using these things are appropriately monitoring for that or risk stratifying their population for that. I think that's how to do it, not to make it more individual, not to just say like this is a one size fits all approach. So I strongly believe that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love this notion of individualized medicine. I'm personally also a big proponent of that. And I also see this flaw of big randomized controlled trials that they have is pretty much that there's no individualization and that we average out all of the populations inside those trials. This eventually then forgets individuality of a patient, of a person itself. So I totally agree with that. That being said, people like, I mean, the best researchers in the world, for example, Eric Topol, call the rollback, what did he say? To quote him, maybe not 100%, but somewhat, a disaster in the works because there's no new safety or efficacy data. So what would you say to him, and how can we make sure that also these researchers out there which want the evidence, which want the RCTs, which want the meta-analysis, how can we build a model that is also sufficient maybe for them? Is there any way, or will we always have this clash between people?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, look, I deeply respect Eric. I really enjoy his content, and I think he brings a very valuable perspective. And I think his concern is warranted. I think what I would say is like we have to build the systems to monitor what's happening, right? And to see how does this help us advance our knowledge, right? At the end of the day, what we're doing here should advance our knowledge of biology and our own health, right? Like that's the bottom line, right? If with what we're doing does not improve our understanding of human biology, then it's a massive failure. So what we have to do is build, not just make these things available, but build systems to collect data. And this is where like the government can play a role, right? Like they can, for example, require that physicians who prescribe these things have to also participate in a registry, right? Where they submit data about how these things are having an effect clinically, right? There's also more kind of market oriented solutions where companies can just choose to do research and kind of monitor these things because they think it will help them have better protocols or have more effective plans, and that then gives them an advantage in the market, right? So I think these sorts of things are what needs to happen. I don't think that the right answer is, okay, let's stop the presses, take these away, let's wait 10 years and study all of these and then make them available, because that'll never happen. That'll never happen. Like, everyone knows it's never going to happen, right? So we have to find a new way.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting idea with this patient registry, that the, prescribing and the physician that oversees that whole process has to submit, because that would be a very interesting way of generating that data in a safe way, where the data is also, ideally, there are the, protection systems in place to really make sure that that data is safe. But it's also that the physician has a complete oversight over what's happening, to then also, can intervene if things are, going sideways. And I think that's very interesting, because it seems like, and you've said that in the beginning, that, a couple of years ago, it was more that hormone hype. Now it's more that peptide hype. And we've seen with hormones that people have likely been denied treatment that would have helped them a lot, especially women and, in menopause, because now more and more evidence is coming out that maybe the risk assessment that has been done 15, 20 years ago was not the correct one. And I think we should always look at these things very much in detail, because obviously we have to look at what will be the cost of treating something and the cost of something potentially going sideways. But at the same time, we need to look at what is the cost of not acting. And so the cost of people staying where they are, and especially if they are currently dealing with a difficult health situation, that also has a cost. So it doesn't mean that this does not have a cost. And I think we really need to balance that out. And I think the idea of the patient registry, so at the same time offering this to the market, especially the ones who make that informed consent, personal risk reward assessment, whilst having physician oversight, whilst generating data in a way where we can, derive bigger insights from it. I think that would be actually a really, really cool idea.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And yeah, it's, again, like, it's not something that just happens automatically. Like, we have to, in many ways, like, making these things available is the easiest part, right? Like, that just takes a stroke of a pen, and there's all the incentive in the world to make these, because you can make money off of it. But this is actually the harder part, is like, because, it's, in the short term, there's no incentive to, like, have a registry and do all these things. Like, people will say, "Oh, this is a speed bump," but I think it is important that we try to do things like that, right? Because I think that's how we will actually advance our understanding. If we're not advancing our understanding of our own biology through this, then it's a failure to me.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. There's one thing I'm wondering about. What what makes you think that BPC 157 or TB 500, for example, what makes you so confident in them that you think that we don't need the same rigor, for example, for GLP-1s or insulin, where we have a bunch of clinical trials? So what's the signal moving you towards the direction that those peptides, that they have potential, that they hold potential? Is it like mechanistic evidence, which also we know that doesn't really equate change in humans all of the time, and it's most of the time different in humans than in cells. So what's the signal moving you towards that direction, that confidence?
Well, I think it's not. Let me just kind of say something before I answer the question, right? Which is, the main reason why I think we need to bring these forward has to do with this general problem of, we need to do research in a different way, right? Like, this standard that you just cited cannot continue to work. It's too slow, man. It's way too slow. And if we continue to go in this standard, we are going to get lapped by China and other countries that are going to have more progressive frameworks for evaluating things. It's too slow. So, like, I'm really thinking about, first and foremost, the bigger picture of research and development, and how do we just get things to market? How do we get advances in medicine into the hands of people faster? And this thing where we're doing studies for 10 years is way too slow. So everything you said about GLP-1s, I mean, yes, it would be amazing to have all that study, but, like, it's too slow. GLP-1s were studied first, I believe, in the early 90s, like 92 or something like that. I mean, the first one, I think, hit the market in maybe 2010 that's almost 20 years. Again, like, technology was much less back then, but that's way too slow. And so we have to speed things up way faster. Like our technology, like at the bleeding edge with robotics and AI, is going to enable way more capacity. So we have to make sure that the commercialization and research apparatus stays apace with that. So I want to put that first and foremost. But to answer your question with those peptides, right? Like there is a lot of anecdotal experience with these. And like I know when people hear the word anecdote, they kind of instantly dismiss it. But like, at this point, these have been used by thousands of physicians, probably at this point on tens, if not hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of patients over the last 5 to 10 years. And we see like consistently enough that there is meaningful improvement. And we see, importantly, in many cases, situations where other conventional therapies have failed, that these therapies seem to have a positive effect. And like there's countless stories and anecdotes, and there are some research studies actually for each of these. They're fairly narrow, but like they're not. And so I think all of these things put together, right? Like what I said up front, and then also the tens of thousands of data points that we have, albeit informal, anecdotal, set it up to me where I say, hey, like this feels like the set of compounds to go press forward with to bring ourselves into this new paradigm of medicine where we start to evaluate things in a way that is different from how we were before. And we're bringing things forward in a little bit more of a gray area, but we're at the same time doing so with the right systems to learn and advance our knowledge. And importantly, also to keep people safe and to find the best treatments for them, right? Like that's ultimately the goal as well.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point of view. I would like to make a little bit of a bridge here to the topic of biomarkers, because we've been talking about how to measure this impact and how to maybe bypass the traditional system while still generating evidence. And I think there's always a bit of a question in terms of biomarkers for health optimization. And it's interesting asking you, because obviously you are in your work at also Superpower, you are on one hand kind of recommending it to people, or or providing solutions that people can use and that likely some people will use and benefit from. On the other side, we do have this thing that we know that the lifestyle factors matter most. And I'm wondering to what extent first everyone would really be better off if we were just testing way more frequently. Would that actually translate into better health? And then the second question, which kind of goes along with that, is that there's been recently this 117-year-old Spanish woman who turned out to get to a very old age with not the best biomarkers. So there has been some sort of a little bit of a surprise here that her biomarkers weren't as perfect as one might have predicted based on how old she got. So the two questions here: how to balance? Is it really better for everyone to test way more, and does it actually equate into better health outcomes? And do we actually know what leads to better health if we are maybe more than just once surprised by people who seem to prove it different?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Biomarkers are probably one of my favorite topics because they give us a window into what I like to say is biological ground truth, which is like what is actually happening at the level of the cell. I'll first say that the markers that we use today, in my opinion, are tremendously inadequate. They don't really come close to telling us what's happening at the level of the cell, right? Like, as you guys know, something like hemoglobin A1C, which we use to say, oh, this is a marker of your metabolism, is so far removed from what happens within mitochondria. Because what we actually care about in all of this, in that case, is like how efficient are the mitochondria and how efficient is that axis of insulin signaling and glucose metabolism and energy production. How efficient is that axis? A1C is so many degrees removed that it doesn't really actually tell us like what actually is going on that's causing that. And so I think biomarkers are important, but we need much better ones. And they actually do exist, right? Like they exist in research labs, right? Like these multi-omic tools, but they have not entered the clinical paradigm. And so I think that we need to do better to bring more advanced biomarkers into clinical settings. Like we've been using these same like CBC, CMP, A1C. This stuff has been there for like 50 years now. Like we need new and better biomarkers. And it's happening slowly, but like we need like a new paradigm where we're, in my opinion, much closer to cells and we're able to distinguish between different compartments, right? Like, for example, the liver versus skeletal muscle versus brain versus, and so on, right? Like we have to be able to have that resolution too. But to kind of answer the question that I think you're asking, I do think there is value to testing, but I don't think it's one size fits all. Like I don't think, and like honestly, it's probably in my commercial interest to say like everyone should test all the time. But like actually, I don't think that's actually true. Um, I'll mention one thing, which is that there's a recent paper that showed, and I think this is just one of the things, like people sometimes don't. There are things that we tell ourselves that we want to believe are true, but sometimes science suggests otherwise, right? And one of the things that's been around lately has been this idea that like, oh, your genetics don't really matter that much. It's more about your environment and so on. And I'm not saying that's not true, but there was a recent paper that came out. I think you may have seen the same thing, Niko, that actually said, hey, actually genetics do matter quite a bit. And I think like intuitively, like we see this play out. I think this woman in Spain is a good example, right? Like and like I really do believe looking at these exceptional cases as being instructive, right? Like how is it possible that somebody can seemingly do all the wrong things, like smoke and drink and not really sleep and not exercise that much and still live so much longer than people who are doing all the right things? And I think that, genetics are absolutely a key piece there. And so I think we have to take observations like that seriously. And I don't think it means like, oh, longevity is hopeless. Like we're never going to, I think, no, I think we just have to understand those systems better. Like what are the genes that these people have that seem to be so protective? Like maybe it's FOXO3 or whatever, and figure out how do we amplify those through compounds and other interventions. So I think there's something learnable there. Yeah, my bottom line take on biomarkers is that it should be personalized, it should be individualized, and we also need better biomarkers. Yeah, like I think that, and I also don't discount the real, and this is now kind of the more fuzzy side of things, but like there is like a mental burden to measuring, right? And you see how biomarkers and measurement and certain tests can provoke anxiety, and that anxiety itself is counterproductive, right? Like one of the things we're learning more and more is how powerful the brain is in driving the health of the whole body. And so you have to just think about what is the consequence of the thing that you're measuring, and is it going to holistically produce the right result? I think until we have like much, much better biomarkers, right, that we really have confidence of reflecting ground truth, I think we're going to have to like individualize the approach. But I think at some point in the future, when we have really, really good biomarkers, I think it will make a lot of sense to just do it. We will be measuring everyone. Like, I don't see a future where at some point we don't start doing that. I think right now things are imperfect. And so we have to just be more nuanced and balanced.
I really like this very nuanced take of yours, and I agree with regards to both, the genetic side of things and maybe the things that we don't like to hear because it doesn't fit the mental model we have created for ourselves before. But also with regards to the biomarkers and how maybe inaccurate they can be, giving the example of hemoglobin A1C. It's interesting because also recently people start to understand that, when they start to train for a marathon and they are exercising a lot and then they are also fueling a lot with carbs, that their hemoglobin A1C rises, which is, the long-term blood sugar, which is usually an indicator of diabetes. And not going into the diabetic range yet, but maybe being elevated from before. And that's actually not a sign that they are metabolically unhealthy. So I completely agree that there are, the biomarkers we currently have are not the best ones. You mentioned a bit the topic of multi-omics. If you had to predict 3 biomarkers that you think in 10 years will capture the function of our cells better than the ones we have now, which one would they be?
Well, I don't think it'll be like 3. I think it'll be like 10,000 or something
Okay.
that together tell us about how a cell is behaving, right? Well, In fact, I know it won't be. So I can tell you what it won't be, which is what you just said. They asked me, because I think yeah, our cells are just tremendously complex machines, biological machines, and the ultimate goal is to understand at any point in time how are these cells functioning in a given compartment, right? And even then, it's complicated because one cell is not going to be functioning the same as the next, and so we're going to have to. I mean, it's so complicated if you really think about it, but it's also at the same time knowable. This is not unknowable, right? It's not like this is completely beyond our comprehension. If we had the right measurements, we could theoretically measure the function of every cell, and we can get representative models of how things are working. And I think that's where compute and AI just are tremendous, right? Because they can grasp these things in ways that our feeble minds cannot, right? So that is that gives me a lot of excitement.
Yeah, makes sense. What I'm wondering here is, and I would really love to get to know your take on this, is that I mean that pretty much every month, every week, a new biomarker gets released and maybe even hyped. For example, plasma phosphorylated tau, p-tau 217, for example, is quite in the hype right now, or GDF15, or whatever advanced lipoproteins, epigenetic clocks, especially, unit pace, or whatever you name it. From inside the industry, can you tell which of these are actually useful or which are noise? And what I'm wondering right now is all of these may be actually useful, maybe due to AI, due to algorithms, which can put all of them together and then get to a decision, then get
Yes,
to an output. Are all
I
of
think
those
yes.
valuable, or are some noise?
Yes. So I think yes to what you said, although I would separate epigenetic clocks from specific kind of biomarkers, right? I think epigenetic clocks are more integrative, right? They're actually not measuring specific biomarkers. They're basically making statistical correlations between methylation patterns on DNA and then inferring kind of biological age across different dimensions. I think they're more kind of composites, right? They're giving you a composite of how a system is functioning. They're not telling you how the system is functioning. Or they're not telling you why, they're telling you how well, right? So it's kind of you know, if you imagine a car, right? You can take it to the mechanic and they can do a diagnostic of what's going on with the engine and the brakes and the carburetor, all these different things you can. Or there's also kind of a performative test where you drive the car and you see how fast it goes. There's not the best analogy, but I think you understand, right? I think epigenetic clocks are kind of more like the second, right? Where we're seeing how well a system is functioning based on the methylation patterns tell us a little bit about how well the system is functioning, but they're not telling us why. At least right now. I actually do think there's probably something we can do, and I've spoken to Ryan at True Diagnostic. I actually do think there is a way that we can take the methylation patterns themselves and where those loci are located and infer the how. But I think that's still kind of being worked on.
Very interesting. So, as we are slowly heading towards the end of this episode, we still wanted to discuss a few other things and also putting you on the what we call hot seat, of where we give you a question and then you have to give an answer that is 30 seconds or shorter. But I actually wanted to ask you one other thing before, because I've seen on your LinkedIn that you've been talking about what you've seen during your travels in Europe and how that maybe antidote to American optimization culture can have very positive effects on health. I think it was in Switzerland. And yet at the same time, you are advising companies in the US on selling optimization services. How do these two work together? And is there a middle ground?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I appreciate you bringing up that post. I think there is a middle ground, right? And I think what I was referring to there was, and I think this connects to back what I said just a minute ago about the power of the mind and driving health throughout the body, right? I think that there is something, and I actually do think environments affect our minds in ways that we don't, and our health in ways that we don't really understand, right? It's not just oh, how much air pollution is there, how much microplastics. It's not that. I am not saying that also counts, but I also think, for example, like the energy of a place, like how people like conduct themselves, I think like these things also matter. And I think, there is something to that. I don't think I have the words or the science to put to it. But I think like in a place like Europe, like it is, people are just, they move through their lives a little bit more slowly and with more kind of a deliberate pace, right? Which has its pros and cons, right? Like it does mean that on the con side, like it can be harder to get things done from a business perspective. But on the pro side, like I think there's all these other things that may bring your biology into better balance, right? And I think in America, right, like, and this has been true of America like since the beginning. That's why I think that since the beginning, after Europeans came there, right? Like to be accurate. But America has always been like a place where people go to hustle and build and create a new life. Like this has been the ethos of this place from the beginning. And so to me, like that is like part of the energy here. That is part of like how people conduct themselves here. And I think that has benefits, obviously. Like, you look at America's like leadership position economically. But I also think that there's like a cost to that, right? That happens here. And so I think as it relates to health optimization, I think, yes, we should make use of tools and testing and compounds and things like that. But I think also like environments matter too. And not just environments in the sense of like, oh, I want to get rid of all of my microplastics and have all these water filters. And I'm not saying that this stuff doesn't matter, by the way. I actually had a, really,
I'm a big fan of that.
but I just think like sometimes like, hey, like what if what if living in another place somehow brings your biology into balance because of these other factors, right? Like maybe it's just the energy of the place, right? I don't know. Like, so I think that there is like as sometimes as yeah, like I think like even this softer stuff matters too. And I think we just don't have the science yet to place it, but I think it does matter.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't agree more. I studied in Italy, Portugal, Germany, and the US, and there was such a huge difference between especially Italy and Portugal and then the US. The cultures were completely different. In the US, everybody was working at the cafe, pretty much everybody. I was once in a cafe and they did interviews there just to hire a new position, which was pretty crazy to see. And then in Italy, they just go out for lunch like 2 hours in the middle of the workday. In Lisbon, we always went to the beach. So completely different lifestyles, which is extremely interesting. But as Miguel already mentioned, and now we get to the lightning round. So you have 30 seconds or less to answer a question. And we'll start with the first one, which is one metric which is actually worth tracking in your opinion.
I think body composition is something everyone should track. I think it's a great composite of how effective your biology or metabolism is working for you. So looking at body fat percentage, visceral fat, skeletal muscle, all of that.
Interesting. One metric that's noise.
I mean, I don't think anything is noise per se. I think maybe the better way to think of it is like, what is something that gets overinterpreted? I actually think A1C. I think there was a point in time where people were like, oh, you got to drive your A1C to 5 or lower. And it's just, there's no reason for that. And like A1C is actually a multifactorial. It's not just, bad metabolism. Of course, you know, insulin resistance can play a role, but it's also many other things that can cause A1C to be elevated that do not reflect bad health.
Yeah, definitely. What is one intervention that actually moves the needle?
Well, this is going to sound lame, but exercise exercise, nutrition, sleep, but I think I would call out exercise in particular just because of how broad the benefits are. Right? Like if you just study the systems biology of exercise, like just all the different pathways that are being activated, it's really remarkable. It's remarkable.
On the contrary, one intervention that's overhyped.
Again, like I don't think anything, I think everything has its merits. I would say like probably cold plunging. I've seen that just be over applied to many people. And actually for a not trivial number of people, cold plunging is actually net harmful because it is a tremendous stress on the system, especially for women. I've observed, and there is often not enough of a recovery balance to that. And I think there are other ways to get hormetic stress that, don't require that. And with all that being said, like I will occasionally take cold showers. I get some benefit from it. But I think the way in which that's professed, I think is a little bit beyond
Oversold.
the benefit. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. This one is interesting, I think. What is one question every patient should ask their longevity doctor or even their general practitioner?
Yeah. I think like, why are you doing this is a really important question. Even though it doesn't really necessarily address their health situation, I think you'll get a sense for like what's the motivation of the person who's taking care of you? Like, why are they doing it? And, no one is going to be honest and say it's for money, but like just listen to how is it personal or not? Not saying that it has to be personal for it to be worthwhile or valid, but like just, you know, I think just asking that question is important because it helps you understand like what is the energy, what is the passion that they're bringing to what they're doing.
Definitely. So let's get to the final question, which is our return on health question, which is if you could change one thing in the current healthcare system, what would it be?
Which healthcare system? America or
We'll just take America healthcare system. Yeah, why not?
yeah. And by the way, I hate that so often the conversation is so America centric.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the reasons why, as you may have known, like we're putting on a conference in the fall and we've chosen to do it in Japan, for many reasons, but one of them is just we want to create a more global environment for this conversation. But to answer your question, I think probably the one thing I would change is the people who are doing hard work should be rewarded more, right? So the hard work in medicine, and now I'm not talking about longevity only, I'm talking about just medicine broadly, but like the really hard work that's done by like nurses and home health aides, which requires like physically working with people. Like those should be some of the highest paid jobs in our society, right? Like the hard work of taking care of people they should be paid a lot of money, in my opinion. And I think if we could get more people into those positions, the best people into those positions, I think that would have so many benefits for health in some ways. So from a systemic perspective, that's one thing I wish was different.
Very interesting. So we've talked about so many interesting things today. We have touched upon, the biggest hype topics back then, the hormones, the biggest hype topics right now, the peptides and where this field is headed. How kind of now through people using it at scale, the traditional system of generating evidence gets a little bit under pressure, and maybe we need to find new ways of generating that evidence while still already giving people access to them, especially if they make an informed consent choice after having an individual risk reward assessment. And we've talked about what the future of biomarkers will look like and where we will be looking at in the next 5-10 years, and that it likely will not only be this one biomarker, but a collection of biomarkers to derive better insights on the cellular health, which then is reflected later on in all organs and systems. So thank you very much, Dr. Anand, for sharing your very interesting insights with us today.
Thank you guys. This was fun.
Thanks a lot. Return on Health is available wherever you get your podcast, and we link all of Anand's social links in the description. See you next week.